He just stood there, staring at the damage and shaking his head. He couldn't believe what just happened as he got onto all fours to get a closer look at the driveway beneath his car. Surely things can't get any worse. As he examined the concrete slabs, he realized that it could, in fact, get worse. But when he heard a sickening sound that he felt in the pit of his stomach, he stared in a combination of amazement and dismay at what he was seeing. House hunting is always an adventure and a risky business. There are so many things to consider, and it's not always easy to know what you are getting yourself into. 37-year-old Mark Simons from England knew that he couldn't pass up the bargain he found on a house in Luton, England. When he heard that his offer had been accepted, Mark was delighted and quickly signed the necessary paperwork. Since it was such a good deal and he was excited about the future, Mark never considered why the seller was in such a rush to sell. A few months later, Mark was finally moving into his new home. He felt excited as he carried his boxes into the house and couldn't wait for his first night in his new home. He began unpacking the boxes until he was so exhausted that he headed to bed. Climbing into bed, Mark calculated what time he would need to get up for work. He couldn't help but smile as he set his alarm for 8 a.m., later than he previously had to. He settled in and got ready to sleep. That was when he heard the noise. Simon immediately felt wide awake, holding his breath as he listened. Nothing. He was just about to relax when he heard it again. As he lay there in the dark, he heard the unmistakable sound of gravel scraping over metal, coming from outside. He carefully snuck over to his window and peered outside. However, instead of finding the source of the sound as he hoped, he saw nothing in his garden below, and the sound was gone too. He shrugged it off and went back to bed, clueless as to what was happening right under his feet. The next morning, Mark prepared to go to work. Once he was ready, he jumped into his car, a black Vauxhall Zafira, and reversed out of the spot. Or rather, that was the plan, but instead, he lurched forward and the car was stuck. It wouldn't move. Confused, Mark kept revving and reversing the car until it finally pulled free. He stopped the car once he was free, deciding to see what he had been caught on. The moment he stepped out of the car, he saw it, and it made his blood run cold. He knelt down and looked carefully at the spot. His worst fears were confirmed as he saw the crack in the paving. However, before he could think much about it, he watched as a hole started to open up before his eyes. Mark scrambled away as he watched the hole open, concrete and dirt disappearing into the widening hole. He knew he was powerless as he watched it happen. Finally, the dust settled, and as he waved it away from his face, Mark finally saw the reality of what happened. Mark knew that the house was old, having been built in the 70s by the couple he had bought it from. However, what he was staring at now was most certainly on none of the plans he had seen. Once he deemed it safe, Mark crawled over on his belly, approaching the hole carefully. He gingerly peeked over the edge of the hole and into inky blackness. However, as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something buried in the dirt. He fetched a trowel and set to work. The more he dug, the more he realized that he had found a piece of metal that was protruding from the ground. He cleared away the dirt and grabbed the object firmly and pulled. However, it still wouldn't budge. Heaving harder, Mark was dismayed that it still wouldn't move. There was nothing for it. He would have to dig it out further. Mark set to work again, clearing away more dirt until he noticed that it seemed to be attached to something else. When he had watched the hole form, Mark immediately pictured the worst-case scenario. In his mind, he watched his new house and car get swallowed up by the earth itself. His mind's eye watched a sinkhole destroy everything. Once the initial shock had passed, however, Mark could investigate properly. As he continued to clear away the dirt, he came to the conclusion that he needed help. This was not something he could do without backup, and he called the only person he could think of. Gerald Marks, Simon's father, the only person Simon could think to call, rushed over to see what was going on. Once there, he and Simon started to get to work. They had no professional tools, but they carefully removed all the cracked concrete paving around the hole. As they removed the paving, they uncovered a large rectangular hole in the floor. The idea of there being a secret passage troubled them. Why was it under the driveway? Where did it go? Why had no one mentioned it? Right now, they could only answer one of those questions. Only one way to know for sure. Simon had done his research before buying the old house. He was all too aware that ordnance surveys wouldn't shed any light on the mysterious passageway hidden beneath his driveway. According to the reports, there had been nothing but empty land there before the home was built. A shiver ran down his spine as they began to dig. They dug out shovelful after shovelful of the densely packed mud and carted it away in buckets. The pile of earth beside them grew larger by the hour, and soon the pair had painstakingly excavated around 5 feet of dirt, enough for them to climb down the ladder and investigate, and what they found would shed some light on the house's eerie past. As Simon climbed halfway down the ladder, a strange feeling crept over him. He didn't want to go any further. What if it wasn't safe? He ran back to the house to fetch his selfie stick. With his phone firmly attached, he lowered it into the hole. On the phone screen, he saw that the underground passageway was hiding 2 rooms. Gerald thought he knew what they were looking at immediately, but they had to be sure. Simon had purchased the property in question for around $500,000, but the land had been used for something else long before the house was built there. The elderly man who had sold the house to Simon was the original owner of the home, but he'd neglected to tell Simon what lay underneath. The sounds he had heard the night before had been the earth finally giving way under the driveway as it fell into the secret room. Simon and his father stopped digging and began to do some research of their own. They looked up the plot number, and then things became apparent very quickly. Prior to the previous owners of the house, this plot of land had stood empty. But Gerald quickly pointed out that the land was situated in a strategic place in the town. But even more telling was the period in which the house had been built. "My dad saw it and instantly said it's an air raid shelter," Simon said. "We Googled it and found there are quite a few in this area. After conducting some research, Simon found out that the shelter had been built during World War II. The previous owner must have known it was there, and when he built the house and put a garden in, he must have filled it in," Simon told the reporters. In 1938, during WIR, a man by the name of Sir John Anderson was tasked with preparing the county for war. It was his duty to come up with a strategy to protect Britain's citizens from the impending onslaught and the bombings that he knew was coming. So he devised an ingenious plan to ensure the civilians' safety. Sir John Anderson and his team of engineers planned and helped to create cheap and simple underground shelters that could easily be buried in people's backyards. The close proximity meant that British citizens could seek shelter at a moment's notice. These structures' walls were constructed from lightweight and flexible metal, a better alternative to concrete. Over 2 million of these bomb shelters were scattered around the country, but what Simon had found was not one of these. Just by looking at the chamber that Simon had found, Gerald could immediately tell that it wasn't an Anderson-designed bomb shelter, but it had indeed been built around 1938, not long after a bomb landed in the area near Luton. Citizens in the area were frightened when they learned that their small city was now a target. They had to find a better way to stay safe. The community came together and quickly devised a plan to create a community shelter that was built to better withstand the air raids. Gerald could tell that the shelter that they had uncovered was definitely not an Anderson-style shelter. It had at least 2 rooms and was constructed from bricks and concrete. And as Simon and Gerald dug deeper into the shelter, they uncovered some unusual artifacts. In one of the hidden rooms, Simon and Gerald found a newspaper clipping. The Herald newspaper dated from the days of war, and one of the headlines read, "Luton Airport, is this the end?" while other articles detailed the goings-on of daily life in the war-torn country. This artifact offered a rare glimpse into British life during the war, but it wasn't the only relic they found. Simon and Gerald also found evidence that proved that the bomb shelter had once been stocked up with food and water to sustain the people who hid there. After all, people who were held up in underground shelters could be stuck there for days at a time. "It's incredible to think it has all been made by hand," Simon later told reporters. The concrete walls of the underground shelter had been reinforced by brick and mortar, which created a further buffer to protect it from the raids from above. But even after Simon and Gerald had finally unearthed the monumental discovery, their work still wasn't done. It's been a case of dig, dig, dig. We're about 5 feet down at the moment, so it's just another 5 feet to go until it's finished. "I think we're going to have to get a skip in because there's so much rubbish to get rid of," Simone stated. Then the pair made another discovery. Some of the walls has been bricked up. I'm 90% sure we won't find out any more rooms, but we don't know. They might have bricked up one of the walls when the house was built to make way for the foundations, Simon told reporters. If that's the case, we'll just have to leave it, he added. But it wasn't long before the discovery went viral. As Simon and his father continued to dig, news reporters and neighbors began to flood into his front driveway just to get a look at the amazing and historic discovery. But Simon didn't care much for all the attention he was receiving. His concerns lay elsewhere. He didn't spend hours digging up his driveway for fame. Simon felt that it was important to let the world know about his discovery, but not for notoriety. He feels that he has an obligation to his country's rich history. He didn't want this piece of history to be forgotten. He wanted the air raid shelter to be preserved for future generations. So what does he plan to do when the shelter has been completely cleared? Simon and his father plan to restore the shelter and preserve it. They hope that it will be declared an important and historical monument. They believe that just because the war is over and long past, that period in time should never be buried and forgotten. They hope that future generations will visit the shelter and catch a glimpse of an important part of history.